Hello everyone, my name is Sam and welcome once again to the Over Manga Cast, or as we've long threatened it, the Over Echo Chamber Cast. Hello Jacob.
Yep, it's just the two of us this time. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, Matt and Jay are off. I think they got wrapped up in a tournament arc somewhere, so we are holding down the fort on their behalf, and that is a good time for us to talk about something near and dear to both of our hearts, games.
Games are such a interesting both tool of storytelling inside of a story and outside of a story. You know, if you look at something like, for example, Dragon Ball, for the most part, when a hero is fighting a villain, it's relatively speaking a battle to the death. And, you know, there's a sense of honor and fair play in the sense of, you know, don't hit below the belt. You know, don't beat on somebody who's already down that the good guys will adhere to, but there's nothing enforcing that. Some stories, on the other hand, will actually go in the exact opposite direction, where there is a systematized structure to the game.
And that's what we're here to discuss. Games being used as the basis of stories, and its inverse kind of stories being used as the basis for a game.
Yeah, the vehicle for a interactive experience.
And we'll save the big video essay word to start off with, ludonarrative dissonance.
Well, we'll get to that once we eventually and inevitably dovetail out of manga into video games. Well, we promise it will be interesting.
Yeah, exactly. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about with this is to kind of put on my armchair anthropologist hat for a second. Games have kind of been a long-standing vehicle of storytelling in human society. We already know that sports make for readily apparent narratives in their own right. But you see stories about wagers and games and the tricksters that engage in them most often all throughout history. There's the famous myth of Loki's wager, where he bet his head and ended up getting his lips sewn shut because he never said anything about his neck. And even to more modern day folk tales about heroes driving steel against machines to make a point.
The thing about the trickster hero character is it's someone who can operate in very nearly any context, but something with rules is a really good example of how to really show off the cleverness of a trickster hero, or indeed a trickster villain as well. Because as much as it's a game, especially if there's some kind of like tangible life or not even necessarily life or death, but tangible serious stakes, the idea of bending the rules as far as they go, not even necessarily in the sense of actively cheating, but making a point of staying within the rules, but still putting yourself in an inherent advantage. That is one of the highest heights of cleverness. And trickster heroes are an excellent showing of that kind of cleverness. Because, like, strictly speaking, you can have something like a character with a weak power set, but using it very cleverly, and that has a very trickster hero vibe to it. But they really shine when there's a rule set that they bend to their advantage.
Yeah, because the restriction inherent within it breeds a kind of creativity. I don't know about you, Jake, but I'm certain that most of our listeners have played a video game that gave too many options and you are struck with the dread analysis paralysis. When you have so many options, your brain just kind of shuts down. So that in and of itself could be why games make for such exciting narratives, because when the reader or when the person consuming the media knows the bounds that the characters have to play within, basically puts us directly on the sidelines where we can observe and scream excitedly when someone does something tricky.
It limits the options to a degree that you can at least try to guess, and it can in many cases be easier to follow. Of course, when it's done well, there is the aspect of a story can set up a rule set and then just break it which
Yeah.
which when it's not really done intentionally can be a pretty serious problem.
There is sort of a way where you can do that right, but you really need to like do that, think about it from the start and play it up. You know, reaching the point where the rules get tossed out the window and it's suddenly a free for all can be very cathartic as a
Mhm.
storytelling device, because now all the like tension of, oh, we got to stay within the bounds, we got to play the game, it's suddenly just gone.
Funnily enough, the thing I immediately think of is, to a large extent, that is almost all of the positive and negative that I felt about our last reading of Platinum End. Uh, that's exactly the whole thing, because like it doesn't really have to be a game. And, you know, Matt in that episode, go check out that episode, mentioned that, you know, maybe it is always supposed to be a death game, and it not needing to be a death game is part of another layer to the story. But strictly speaking, at its face value, it doesn't need to be a game. So, you know, everybody's being clever and playing within this particular rule set. And then at the end, when they're in their final battle with Metropolyman, it's like,
Mhm.
yeah, I'm not stabbing you with the red arrow anymore. I'm just holding you down so someone can shoot you with a gun. Like,
Yeah, it's that exact thing. My personal favorite example, it's outside of the manga space, but in the Dresden Files, spoiler alert for like book number 17, I think. It's pretty late in the series, so if you haven't read past changes, you might want to skip ahead a few minutes. But the big climax of Skin Game, where the main character himself screams game over, pulls out his trump card, and then it all kind of devolves into a madcap slurry of violence that goes right up until the end.
these are all example in a Platinum End, dubiously, but these are examples of that sort of thing being done right. But there can also be the case where you have a particular rule set, you're playing the game, and then someone just overtly breaks the rules
Mhm.
and it devolves into chaos, and it's not satisfying.
Oh, they're playing rock, paper, scissors, and then someone else pulled out gun. It's like,
Yeah. One of the best examples I have of this is also slightly outside of the manga space. I think this also has a manga, but I haven't looked that hard for it. The series Bakugan. I
mhm.
thought that the first season was an admirable attempt at basically doing Beyblade right, which I've always referred to Beyblade as all the worst parts of Pokemon and all the worst parts of Yu-Gi-Oh fused together.
Oh
So,
God, you're right.
good Beyblade is kind of what I consider Bakugan, which it's like, okay, fine, this is a good kid show to sell toys. I'll sit down with this for a little while. But my God, I remember a second season episode made me quit the entire franchise cold turkey instantaneously, because there was a character who had, via losing a wager, had to work with the bad guys. So they forced her to fight 2v2 with one of the bad guys against the two good guys. And there was a whole thing about like her allegiance being questioned and stuff like that. It's like, you know, would she be on our side if we, you know, rescued her or whatever, and now she's fighting against us. And it starts off really clever where it seems like she's, you know, because Bakugan is gamified combat, and honestly, Bakugan is actually kind of an example of what are the rules of that game? They never really tell you, so they can kind of do whatever the hell they want. But the way they initially present it is she is intentionally making extremely aggressive plays that are fine from her perspective, but bad for the team overall. And I'm like, oh, that's really, really clever. She then rounds on her teammate and starts attacking them with absolutely no change in the circumstances. And then the game just stops and the heroes run away with the character whose allegiance was being questioned. And it's like, no, you don't get to do that. No part of the game said you were allowed to switch sides like that. If you could just do that, why the f were you there in the first place?
Why are we even playing this game?
Why do we have rules if you're just going to ignore them? And like, that's sort
Mhm.
of the double-edged sword of games. Though that does bring up an interesting aspect of gamified stories, which is, how do you ensure that the bad guys even play the game at all? Because that's a
Yeah,
really important factor in storytelling.
because the participating in a game implies an inherent sense of honor. And unless you're writing a magnificent bastard, most villains are, bad guys because they don't really have a sense of honor and will do anything to win. And why should they indulge you in your card games on motorcycles? To temporarily go back to the Dresden Files, one of the reasons it works in that is because one of the themes of that story is that while someone can have a lot of power, power comes with it responsibility. Guess who read a lot of Spider-Man as a kid? And responsibility is its own kind of chain. And so if you don't use your power responsibly, the power can literally just go away. It'll say, no, I'm not working for you anymore. That means even the most dastardly bad guy has to at least play within the restraints of his own rule set.
And one of the most common ways of keeping bad guys honest is by tying the ability to do things to playing by the rules. It's also a really good way of stopping cheaters, because if you do cheat, then the game will just punish you either by auto losing and you lose whatever you were going for, or in some more serious cases, because for some reason death games almost always get gamified, you'll just die if you cheat too much or too hard or too overtly. The other really common way of getting bad guys to play the game is actually a kind of fun one that somewhat ties into Trickster Heroes a lot. And it's the idea that the game is set up by the bad guy. This also is to some extent, I think, the reason why death games get gamified so often.
Because they have some big cheesy villain who comes in and says, and now for my entertainment, you will do it like this.
That's how you get your Pegasuses. That's how you get your, whatever the first villain of SAO is.
Oh my god, Pegasus is a death game villain, isn't he?
Oh, he is. He absolutely is.
I never thought about it like that, but you're right.
I mean, to a large extent, that's also how you get your Dark Yugi, truth be told. That's why he's the murder goblin. I mean, how do you get the murder goblin to play the game? He's the one setting them up. It's how he uses his magic powers. That's a synthesis of both of those ideas. I do also think that it's really interesting that so often, and like this is also something that I see a lot. There's a series that I really want to get back into called Zero Game. It's a manhwa. It's another one of those examples, but I see this so often where it's like you have a death game set up, and then it's like, but who started it and why is so often a plot point brought up. I mean, funnily enough, like we made the joke about SAO, but like, the fact that they didn't answer that question is one of the principal criticisms of SAO, is the fact that it's like you set up this big mystery and then did nothing with it. Like, this is just such a common setup. And I honestly can't off the top of my head figure out why, you set up a death game, people follow the rules because the villain is the one killing people.
Yeah.
And then figure out who I don't get it.
One of the things about SAO in particular, and you can kind of tie this into the idea of just using your world building as a means of forcing the bad guy to play by the rules. But SAO has the misused, one would say, benefit of being an actual, like, hard-coded video game.
Yeah.
So there are certain ineffable, without the use of, like, cheat codes or whatever, or hacking the system, rules that must be obeyed. It's akin to just having the laws of physics of your setting just say, no, you have to do it like this. You could even argue that that is part of how it sort of works in Yu-Gi-Oh! The whole point being the shadow games. So if you're not going to play the shadow game by the Millennium Items rules, then they'll just off you.
They'll either not work, or like if you just try to use them as a blunt instrument, they won't work at all. And if you try to cheat during the game, they'll just kill you.
Best case scenario, you do get sent to the Shadow Realm. I know it's not a place, Jake. You don't have to say
it. Well, no, that is the thing. The best case scenario is you get sent to the Shadow Realm, because going to the Shadow Realm means if you cheat, you die. It's one of those things where I think the fact that you mentioned like the element of world building, there is a sort of like nice element of it sort of gives free exposition that you can explain what power sets are, because games inherently are within a certain limit. But one of the natural things inherent to writing a story about games is that all of the rules are based off of what the author decides the rules are.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, even if it's an actual video game, like it's still from the perspective of like the person who created the space makes the rules of what you can or can't do.
Yeah.
But the danger in a story is that, because it's not like a hard-coded thing, you can, like, the author chooses what rules to bend. Because like there's this element, and this goes back into like the idea of trickster heroes. And it's like what qualifies as rule breaking in a shadow game, for example. And
yeah, what's just clever screwing around, and what is, something that's going to get you yeeted. It's ultimately up to God, in this case being the author.
That's actually a really good example of the case where the playing with restrictions idea, the fact that there is this narrow space that you're supposed to exist in, and the risk of stepping outside of that line because the author decides what the rules are and what the rules aren't. That's where you get problems like what happens in SAO, the thing I mentioned from Bakugan. And to some extent, I think one of the things that is it's so hard to just completely embrace the hammy, at least for me personally, it's so hard to completely embrace the hamminess from Platinum End, because I can't tell entirely if you're supposed, like, I can't tell
if that's
how
what's being gone for.
Yeah, I can't tell how seriously it's taking itself. I don't know if I'm supposed to consider what the characters are doing as a clever bending of the rules that they're actually following, or characters in brief spurts just realizing, I can do whatever I want, so I'm going to do the thing that wins.
Wait, I can just shoot him. And that's sort of the thing when you are using games as a heavy story element, because, like it or not, games as a story element makes it near impossible to not notice the hand of the author. And as a fellow writer, Jake, I'm sure you know, one of the things that you always want to strive for is to have the hand of the author be as invisible and lightly felt as possible.
Yeah, unless it's a straight comedy that makes direct jokes about things like lampshading, you don't want to be noticed. Thing like the power set in a shonen is vulnerable to this problem too. But it's like, it's the idea of, if this wasn't allowed, why was this allowed? There are so many cases of that sort of thing.
And it can feel pretty contrived when they're still staying within their same rules, but they've obviously set something up in a way that's going to make X outcome happen.
Yeah, or even another worse case where, and this can either be the author is just done with this arc and cheats for the protagonists to finish off the villain. It's like that goes against the rules you established, or a villain can be maintained for longer than they should be based off of the rules by the villain, like skirting the rule set somehow. That can be really frustrating to an audience, because it sort of signals to the audience that what the things that we're telling you don't actually matter, because we will just ignore that element. And not to bring up the forbidden rage topic, but because I don't think I've conveyed it very well, partially because of my rage at the series, I'm going to try to say it now. This is the reason I loathe Record of Ragnarok, because it does not do that. There's a thing I didn't mention in our second episode that was utterly infuriating, but very validating, because it basically proved the point I wasn't able to make. And I'm sad that I forgot to mention it, so I'm doing it now. You can't stop me.
Well, I edit the episodes. I can stop you, but I won't.
I know where you live. But yeah, it's in the fight between Poseidon and the Japanese swordsman guy whose name I forget. And this is more of a visual metaphor as opposed to a rule getting skirted, but it's the exact same problem. And the internal rules of the manga will just do this too. It's just, this is the easiest example of it. There was the metaphor about his sword reaching the bottom of the sea. And it kept showing that metaphor that, no, it's not at the bottom yet. No, it's not at the bottom yet. No, it's not at the bottom yet. And then at some point, about a third of the way through the fight, it hits the bottom of the sea. So presumably that means that the fight is about to wrap up. And then the ground crumbles underneath. keeps going for another 2/3 worth of that fight. Like, why are you showing me this visual metaphor if it doesn't literally mean anything? Now I don't believe anything that you present me. And when it comes to games, that's the same problem. That's the same risk that you bring to bear with this, because if you say you can only move your piece in a knight's move L, and then someone with no explanation does a pawn capture with that piece without it being explained that that can do that, then why are you even having the rules if you're not going to follow them? And it's such a quick way of getting someone to just depart.
Yeah. But you know what they say, Jacob? Screw the rules. I have money.
Oh my god. Look, okay. Yu-Gi-Oh! Is not as bad about that as people say that it is.
And we're going to take a quick break to get a drink of water before we get into some specific examples. And yourself. We're going to get into some specific examples after this quick break, folks. We'll be right back.
Kaiba did nothing wrong.
And welcome back to the show, folks.
Okay. Had my Snickers. I can be calm now. I promise. Mostly.
Hashtag non-spawn, but I'm glad to hear it, Jake. So, since you are now newly revitalized with the power of candy...
Jokes aside about me and my relationship with mostly how other people see Yu-Gi-Oh!, there is a lesson to be learned relative to Yu-Gi-Oh! I think that most of it is a marketing problem, not a problem with the story onto itself. But there is a important thing to, when you look at the specific example of Yu-Gi-Oh!, the ways that the storytelling can be done right, the ways that it can be misperceived, and when, you know, the misperception is actually accurate, it's just it wasn't originally intended, how it can go wrong. Because this is actually a really good example of the thing that I noted about the authors having total control over the rules. If you go by the manga's rule set, there's, as far as I recall, no rule breaking except for, I think, Bandit Keith, who literally has cards up his sleeves. Oh, and Kaiba also does that with the in his introduction.
I forgot about that. Literal cards up sleeves. I forgot about that.
And other than people pulling nonsense like that, when it comes to, like, you know, hey, did you just summon a bunch of monsters in one turn? Like, that's so mimetic. And I think most people, at least at an intellectual level, understand that that's a meme, not actually a critique of something that either the anime or the manga did wrong.
It's almost like it's from an abridged series.
Almost. But, like, there's this thing about how Yu-Gi-Oh! Basically has, like, I think 4 rule sets at this point. It has the manga rule set. It has the anime rule set, which is significantly more restrictive on what you're allowed to do. It has the original real world rule set, which is very similar to the anime rule set, but with a couple of changes. And then you have the current rule set, which is even more restrictive. And I can't help but notice that a lot of times when people call out Yu-Gi-Oh! Characters for cheating in various cases, if you look at the manga actually gives you the entire rule book. It's all one paragraph. It's a very, very simple game.
And people are probably thinking about the real world experiences they had with the, you know, the actual rules for the game that were, you know, made for
saleable product.
Yeah, saleable product after Duel Monsters became the wildly popular aspect of Yu-Gi-Oh! That it was, or that it is now.
Yeah, and the element of Yu-Gi-Oh! That I think is a really good example of the ways that you can, like I think Yu-Gi-Oh! Did it right, but that factor that there's basically like 4 or 5 different rule sets for Yu-Gi-Oh! That all vaguely look like the same thing, but like there's like insta-lose tier cheating things if you swap rule sets. it actually shows the pitfalls of this sort of thing because the game's rules are actually in the manga extremely simple. The rule book in the real world is pretty beefy. But again, the manga, it's a paragraph. The super expert rules that are the ones that the anime was based off of, and the anime later created the real world rules. The super expert rules is a paragraph that is about less than a third of one page.
Yeah, I remember the old strategy guide I had was like 1/4 talking about actual rules, like one mock game between fake characters, and then a whole bunch of ads for cards disguised as deck building advice.
I had a few of those, I won't lie. The thing about Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that the game itself is not particularly complex. Its base rules are actually super simple. And I think actually the Death Tea arc really shows that off because there's not a lot of wiggle room that the characters have. That's the reason why the Blue Eyes White Dragon is so powerful, because it's a giant stat stick. And there's not a lot of rules that allow you to get around that. What makes Yu-Gi-Oh! Complex is that the cards have their own unique rules, and that's how all card games work. The text on a card is always rule-breaking text. It breaks the rules as written. That's why it's on the card, because the card has the unique ability to break that core rule, that system rule.
And not many things had removal that could deal with just a big stat stick dragon.
Yeah, that didn't exist at the time. So that got introduced. But like, here's the thing. This is both the double-edged sword, the good and the bad of the fact that the author makes the rules of the game. I think it's super freaking clever that the original Duel Monsters rule set is extremely simple because it allows for a lot of fluidity in how you pace out the actual battles in the manga itself. But it means that if an author using this idea ever gets into a certain situation, and this is something that the anime hyper overemphasized and is where this meme comes from, but I can just top deck a card that the audience didn't know existed until now. Now, the way that the manga presents it is more that because you can actually read the text on the card in the manga, so you know that they're actually doing what it says on the card.
That was always the thing that weirded me out, because my first experience was the dub anime.
Yeah.
How do you know what these do?
Yeah, it seems like they're just making it up as they go along. And to some extent, there is things like flying monsters are strong against ground-based monsters in this episode, Joey. Like, there were cases like that in Yu-Gi-Oh! I won't pretend that's not true. But generally speaking, the cards follow their own rules. But like, sort of like the core idea of Yu-Gi-Oh! As a game is that everything is broad enough it can combo into something else. But the more narrow you make the rule set, the more impractical that sort of thing becomes. And that's where this idea that Dark Yugi is cheating because he's just top decking everything he needs that wasn't even in his deck until 2 seconds ago. Like, that's where that idea comes from. And not for nothing, but Yu-Gi-Oh! Is actually a really good example of how to do this kind of storytelling right, the manga, and how to do it wrong, the anime, because the anime uses the more restricted version. Why would you ever use Catapult Turtle? It makes sense in the manga because the rule set is more broad and there are more applications for different things. But that's how you can trip yourself up, and you can see the hand of the author making something up for either the protagonist to win or the antagonist to extend the plot line.
Yeah, and as cool as the scene in, I think the Seal of Orichalcos thing was a filler arc in the anime, right?
Yeah, it's anime exclusive.
As cool as that scene during the Orichalcos arc was, where Yami kept drawing monster cards and beating the piss out of Weevil.
That really famous scene, yeah.
Dura monster card. It's like, okay, buddy, did you seriously have 12 monster cards in a row on the top of your
12 plus, because Anzu rushes in and stops him.
Yeah, that's that effect that you're talking about, where the adaptation, in trying to more gamify it, kind of
it backfired.
It didn't really shoot itself in the foot, but it like grazed its foot, and now it's limping.
Yeah, and You know, like there's the element of Yu-Gi-Oh as a franchise has doubled down on that element, but I'm not gonna get another Snickers.
Yep.
That's
No. So
that's
we're
the
gonna
long and
move
short of the
on.
matter. Yeah, we're gonna move on.
We're gonna move on to something else that definitely does not incite anger, and it's a good thing Matt's not here. Isekai. Uh,
Ah,
I s-
so what MMORPG are we full dive VRing into?
I actually want to talk about Log Horizon, which is it's not exactly an a little known video game isekai, but it definitely came out during the
During the
deluge, the oversaturation post SAO period.
during the craze.
Yeah, it was a pretty good example of its genre. I liked the fact that the main character, instead of being, a combat class and incredibly overpowered, he was actually a support class, which meant that he could do a whole lot more of the, pushes up glasses, flashing lenses, Brock on the sidelines thing, but,
Strategizing.
strategizing and really impacting the plot at the same time. That made him a very fun main character. But one of the ways that Log Horizon kind of subverted the SAO thing about death, you die in the game, you die in real life. And I didn't watch the entire anime, but this is, of the bit that I did watch, this arc always really stuck out in my head, is the idea that if you died in Log Horizon, then you respawn it at a respawn point because it's a video game.
Mm.
The thing is, you had to physically go to another location in the world to set a new respawn point. And if a bunch of player-killing assholes happened to surround the spot where you respawn, then they literally will just spawn camp you until you, break and join their side. And so one of the major plot points was the main character's squad having to, fly off to go rescue a friendly who was trapped in that very situation. And I found that to be a very cool way of taking the hard-coded video game world and keeping the idea of respawning while still maintaining the stakes of death.
Yeah, it's leveraging an element unique to video games to have a plot point unique to Log Horizon. There are so many aspects of video games that are not even necessarily underexplored, but that just are so ripe for opportunity for storytelling in general.
Mm-hmm. And respawning is a big one. That's why I love From Software games so much. Even in the games where you're not explicitly, an undead destined.
Not canonically respawning. Yeah.
Yeah, they managed to weave that in very interesting ways. Sekiro has a very fun one where you are basically just cursed with immortality. And there's a very funny moment where after you defeat a mid-game boss and go to talk with the, important character NPC that you're trying to go save, he's like, how many times have you died for my sake? 1 time? 3 times? And most players who got their ass beat pretty handily by Genichiro before then just laugh. Kuro then does say, or more times than you can count. And, that does kind of play into the same idea of Log Horizon, where it's like, okay, death isn't permanent, but what does dying that many times do to a man?
It's sort of funny because there is that element of, because ReZero is another series that it's not even actually a game as far as I know. He's just going to another world, but it gets framed in respawn
and save points.
Konosuba has skill leveling trees. It's not a game. He's not full time. It's literally just beating up on poor SAO. It's yeah, SAO deserves it, but it's already dead.
Look, the skill leveling system in Konosuba is there explicitly to make jokes about how hilariously over-specialized the 3 girls are. Aqua, full of the most amazing spells ever without the instat to use them. Megumin, with the most powerful destruction magic and no mana. And then Darkness, the tankiest tank whoever what did tank and can't hit something to save her goddamn life.
There is this sort of like strange element to trying to add video game elements to non-video game series, because as we mentioned, having a narrow rule set, shows what characters can or can't do.
Yeah. And that's why it's so interesting to me that after the craze of, video game isekais, we're still, I say after, it's not like we're living in a post-video game isekai world. Look at the title of our freaking podcast and you'll understand the joke.
Yeah, we may never be free of them entirely.
But it's interesting how this idea of the video game fantasy world, or the gamified fantasy world, to put it more broadly, has seeped so much into the culture. Like, I've not seen Black Clover yet, but from some of the, review material I've watched, I have a basic understanding of the power system, and it is pretty gamified. It's got various levels to it. It's got specific classes. It all seems very stratified, which is when main character boy comes in with his main character powers and breaks the rule set that it's interesting. But and another reason why I do want to read it,
yeah,
because it's interesting to see, kind of, again, from an armchair anthropologist perspective, how ubiquitous that has become.
Yeah, and I can't help but find it funny because, not to beat the dead horse even more, but there's sort of a funny element
Jake, I know it's your favorite hobby.
Look, SAO isn't my favorite target. It's just one of them. Yeah, no, SAO. And it's sort of funny because, it does the MMORPG thing, and yet it being a video game doesn't really affect it very much, Big thing about SAO, and I'm borrowing this from and I'm sure, Sam, the video I'll be talking about, but the elements of SAO isn't even really a video game. It basically just uses that aesthetic. If you actually,
I've seen that Jeff Thew video.
If you try to, I'm borrowing this from a Mother's Basement video, but it is really interesting when talking about how game elements and stories interact with each other, that it is merely the aesthetic of a video game. Because if you were actually to try to create like a real, like a playable version of SAO without the full dive, without the death game aspects, it would be utterly unplayable. So it's just like you have something like Black Clover, like Konosuba, like ReZero, that is explicitly not a video game, but uses video game terminology, in part because SAO was so popular, but also because it's just a good engine to convey information to a modern audience. And then you have something that is explicitly a video game that's basically just using it as set dressing.
Yeah.
That sort of dissonance between something that actually is a game, doesn't have to use its own rules, whereas something that isn't a game has a tendency to stick to those kinds of rules more closely, ironically. But since we've been on about a lot of anime stuff, I thought this was a manga podcast. Another really
hey.
Matt's not here. Somebody's got to say it. Another sort of interesting way of looking at games and storytelling is two really good examples are episodes that we have up for you. Chihaya Furu and Haikyuu, in my opinion, are actually a really cool contrast with each other. I can also technically kind of, even though it's not a game, throw Blue Period into the Haikyuu side because, this was something that I mentioned of Blue Period. Which, it conveys the same idea, but, it's more directly with Haikyuu versus Chihaya Furu, where the interesting thing about Chihaya Furu is it doesn't really care if you know the full rules of Karuta or not.
We mentioned numerous times in our episode that we really still don't know how this game is played. We just have enough context clues to get the tension.
Yeah, and that is using a game, something that I just realized we were totally remiss for not mentioning, and we should have mentioned sooner. One really nice thing that you can do with either a sports thing, which is a game, which is gamifying your story, or any kind of game that you're playing, is you can set the stakes extremely low so the protagonist is capable of losing. It's a natural problem with a lot of battle shonens that if the protagonist loses, they die. So they have an inherent level of plot armor unless the author is really clever about how they work around that. And it's
Yeah,
doable, and that's where the good shonens come from, but it's a challenge.
Yeah, and that's and we do bring it up basically every time there's an on-battle battle shonen, like the last Blue Period episode.
Yeah, and indeed, Chihaya Furu and Haikyuu is something that we mentioned in both of those episodes, that these are really good examples of you can set the stakes super low so you don't know, like the protagonist can still win. That's actually one of the fun things about Haikyuu, where the main characters won a match they didn't have to win, and all of the narrative was pointing to it being a case where they'd fail, but it was so much more hype because they won, because you knew they could lose and it would be fine. But the point I originally brought up these two for is Chihaya Furu. I've actually read a little bit ahead in Chihaya Furu, further into then it's I've gotten a little bit better about reading things that I mean to. Finally, Chihaya Furu doesn't really seem that invested in teaching you how to play Karuta. I even looked up a video on the rule set of Karuta, and I have a vague idea of the strategy of the game, but not really. It's really more about the ebb and flow of how the characters are reacting to various things.
Right.
On the other hand, the thing about Haikyuu, and there are a lot of examples of this, technically Yu-Gi-Oh! Falls into this category as well, but like Haikyuu is I think a good contrast with Chihaya Furu, because Haikyuu expects you not to know the rules of volleyball. Actually, I saw a thing about how volleyball might have been a dying sport in Japan if it weren't for Haikyuu, as it turns out.
Funny how media does that. Actually, before you get into that, real quick, something I want to mention about Haikyuu and, basically every sports anime and sports manga is part of the benefit of using a game that exists in real life.
You can look up the rules.
You can look up the rules, and there's a certain amount of expected cultural osmosis of the basic idea of what it is supposed to look like, which helps with aesthetic centering.
Yeah, and actually that's exactly what I was going to go into, because there's a particular reason I picked out Haikyuu as my example to set against Chihaya Furu. And, to a large extent, someone could bounce off of Chihaya Furu if they didn't grab onto the characters. And, well, I have no idea what Karuta is, so bye. So I feel Chihaya Furu, it does it with intention, and I think it works for the series. But this is both an example of these are examples of it doing it right, but also it could be bad. Haikyuu, on the other hand, is really, really good about teaching you not just volleyball rules, but volleyball strategy. And the thing that I really like about it, and the place where it differentiates itself from something like Blue Period or Yu-Gi-Oh! Indeed, is that it drip feeds you information on the rules and the strategy chapter by chapter. It doesn't info dump you, and not even necessarily that it doesn't info dump you, but it doesn't even give you a basic rule set to read at your own pace or ignore and continue reading, ignoring it. Like it integrates it into the story. And I think Haikyuu, one of the things that really got me invested in Haikyuu is it instilled in me a passion for volleyball, because I was understanding why they made the shortest team member the center blocker at the beginning of their match against Abajosai. They explained it and it made sense.
Yeah, and that's what the best of these kinds of stories can do, is if they can give you just enough of the thing that it doesn't become, a boring exposition dump, it allows you to grow this really organic investment with the game.
Yeah. And I mean, the thing is, to a large extent, any rule teaching that they do in Chihaya Furu is that sort of utilitarian upfront information dump. And even though Blue Period is definitely trying to get you into art, it kind of does the same thing, but it does it more consistently. The reason I bounced off of Blue Period in the first thing is because I have garbage eyes. I can't draw. I'm physically incapable of drawing a straight line. So that was part of the reason why I bounced off that very obviously good series. And that's the danger of trying to invest a reader into the game that it is. There are a lot of like card game anime and manga that are trying to sell you literal, actual physical cards. Hi, Card Fight Vanguard. I see you over there. And like to some extent, there's always a risk of if I don't get invested in the game, it's gonna bounce me instantly. But the nice thing about Chihaya Furu is that it never expects you to know the rules, which is the one extreme you can do. And then the other extreme is trying to get you directly invested in the sport. And I think Haikyuu is the best example I've seen of a manga getting me invested without me even noticing. It's really clever and one of the high points of Haikyuu as a story.
Excellent. So we've done a lot of talking about how stories that use games, integrate them in various ways. I want to take a look at the other side of the coin for another for again, not talking about manga on a manga podcast, but
look, I checked the box because Matt's not here, but
another shared passion of ours, tabletop role-playing games. And to at least keep a bit of the anime aesthetic, I do want to talk a bit about my dear beloved Exalted. Because part of the effect of TTRPGs is it's a collaborative storytelling game. You are using the rules that exist within the rule books of, D&D 5e or 1D&D, depending on when you're listening to this.
Or Pathfinder, if you're a tabletop hipster.
Indeed.
No shame, I just see you there.
It's interesting to look at because a lot of these games come with their own lore, their own settings, built that the game rules are supposed to exist within. And that creates the interesting effect of you're often being thrown into this world and expected to create your own little story in it. To talk about Exalted, without getting too deep into the lore of it, this creates the interesting problem. Exalted is a game about escalating power levels and characters that are basically gods. And it's, a power fantasy game. You're supposed to play one of these super mega heroes who goes off and does super mega hero things. A whole bunch of the NPCs are also like that. So why is the world in this current state of stalemate? How has a single Essence 10 Lunar Exalt not gone in and just kicked the ass of the entire realm up and down the Blessed Isle? I don't know. I'm going to throw shade at the D&D community temporarily.
That won't go badly.
Hey guys, stop trying to apply real world physics to game mechanics.
Well, and there is sort of the thing I'm thinking of when it comes to this topic is there's a couple of schools of thought, and almost all of them have a tendency of getting really extreme really fast, and they're almost always really bad when that happens. Because there's the element of, some people will extremely strictly adhere to the rules. You'll get the rules lawyers types. And yes, the rules are there for a reason, and you should follow them. But it's a tabletop game. Bending the rules to make a better experience is valid. Both extremes are wrong. It's strictly adhering to the rules every time, all the time, no exceptions. At that point, play a video game. But on the other hand, you should know the rules, you should follow them, and only break the rules. Because the really interesting thing about something like D&D is it's a game, but also, and it's something that gets bandied about, but I think that there's some level of people, and even myself, not really fully internalizing this, at least for me until recently. It's a storytelling experience. You're not playing to beat the boss like it's a video game. You're playing to act out a narrative,
and the rules are there as a
framework.
As a framework for that narrative. Now, I know there are plenty of people out there who will make the argument that D&D started as a war game and it only became a narrative thing in future editions, and that is valid to an extent, and that's where I kind of want to come back to Exalted. Despite how crunchy the Exalted can be in it, and I see you over there, Jake. Trust me, it's gotten better. It's less crunchy now.
That's the thing, I've only ever played a one-shot. I'm not the one that you need to defend it against. Matt isn't here. I'm soft pro Exalted, but I've only ever
Yes.
played the one-shot.
Exalted is built around the idea of being these mythical heroes, and mythical heroes, so long as they're sticking with their aesthetic, can just do whatever the hell they want. That means it is, at its kind of core, leaning more heavily into the storytelling experience. And I think that is part of the thing of, like, you don't want to examine the current state of the in-game world too closely.
Yeah.
Even worse than realizing that there are NPC 20th level wizards out there in, whatever D&D setting who can cast Wish and just muck up the entire universe.
Yeah.
Even worse than that is realizing, oh no, there are some characters who can have literally every charm in this book. Oh no. So
yeah, and there is also that element of, like, you can create your own setting within these. Like it's very free, it's very open. It allows you to do, it's a sandbox, really, is what it is. I don't know if it's just my personal experiences, but it feels like tabletops have been getting a big resurgence lately.
everybody say thank you, Critical Role. 3, 2, 1.
Thank you, Critical Role. But it's like, like there's been this resurgence of tabletops lately, but also, like, if you look at video games, like even video games that are literally called sandbox games, where you're, going out in your own direction, they're, because the game is hard coded and only has so many responses for you. I love KOTOR, but the force alignment system is pure binary, and it's the worst part of that game. Like there's a neutral in the force version of Revan out there that I think is more true to the actual story that you could do with the Star Wars tabletop RPG. But on the other hand, the problem with tabletop RPGs is that, it can go off the rails. The foreshadowing might not be there because it's people making stuff up as they go along. There's like this, there's this trade-off when you have tabletop games versus video games, where video games naturally have more of a hard narrative that you're playing through, as opposed to making your own story.
That's where we can kind of dive back into the video game experience with, I know there's a few ones close to your heart in this regard.
Yeah, and just because we mentioned up at the top of the episode, we had to make the Ludo narrative dissonance joke. I feel like just, doing our take on Ludo narrative elements. People throw it around as a joke, but I feel like it's a really interesting topic. It's that highbrow sort of thing. But one of the things that when you're experiencing an interactive story, there's that element of your interactivity, whether or not it has an effect on the narrative, is such a big deal when it comes to storytelling.
The diegesis.
the diegesis of it all. In the case of a tabletop game, you're free to have it be your own unique world, and you don't have to worry, and NPCs can react out to the bard seducing the 50th aspect of Tiamat in a row, and that this is just a thing in this world now, and people can actually react to it. In video games, on the other hand, there's this constant pull between player agency and how they interact with the narrative. I have mentioned vaguely a couple of times, I'll come out and say it right now, I am a fighter plane nerd. Obviously, I love Ace Combat. And sort of one of the fun things about Ace Combat and its loving sidequel Project Wingman in particular, because it dials this up to 30.
802 missiles.
But it's the idea that the player character, from a in-game perspective, and like some people have actually criticized this, and actually a particular Ace Combat game, the one that shall remain unnamed, actually criticizes Ace Combat for this. Yeah. But there's this criticism thrown at Ace Combat as sort of like a joke, where it's like, boy, it sure is nice that you have allies that will fire 3 missiles and miss all of them. But there's a reason why that's done. And the reason it's done is because, in the context of Ace Combat, if you're in the middle of an intense dogfight, you line the guy up and you're about to take your shot, and then an AI ally snipes the kill from you, that's really unsatisfying and annoying. So
Yeah.
The game basically sets out, I mean, to some extent, this is also the kind of thing that you'd see in Skyrim, where like the soldier NPCs, or in Fallout, the NPC allies are kind of useless. They won't do anything on their own.
They're mostly just there to absorb hits.
Yeah, and a lot of cases, it's one of those ones where that can create that ludonarrative dissonance, that idea of the game is telling you one thing and the story is telling you another. Ace Combat skirts this by actually in universe having your character basically be a bloodless freak of nature who is canonically a one-man squadron, and people comment on that. But one of the dangers that video game storytelling has is that I have only ever experienced The Last of Us secondhand. I've never actually played it. I've only watched it. And damn if it's not an absolutely excellent story. But it has a gameplay loop. How is Joel still walking past level 3? He should be collapsed from exhaustion. He's not magic.
Yeah, seriously.
How does Ellie lift all of those things that she picks up?
Well, because you have the inventory space. That's why. How come Link is only heavy when he puts the iron boots on?
or any number of video games that there's not a backpack on the character model, and yet you're carrying like 50 suits of armor, 30 swords, 25 axes, 7 crossbows, and 12 billion bolts.
I'm on New Game Plus 3 of Elden Ring. I feel this.
And it's like there is that element of, in a lot of cases, people will just ignore that sort of thing. And in all honesty, even having just watched a game like The Last of Us, it doesn't ruin the experience. It's still just as powerful a story, but there are those fridge logic moments where you realize, wait, that doesn't make sense, and it can take you out of the experience. It's a natural pitfall that any game, I mean, not for nothing, as much as Ace Combat explains that, yes, Mobius 1 is literally a one-man squadron. That's a canonical line of dialogue that someone says out loud in the game. One of the things that the game never explains is you fire a missile, about 4 seconds later, another missile magically shows up on the pylon if you have that much ammo in your hammer space inventory, I guess. And nobody really questions it. Like, Mobius 1 can't be a one-man squadron if he has realistic ammo supplies, because he'd have to constantly be going back to resupply, But
you know what? It's fun.
It's that push and pull between fun and what makes sense from a narrative perspective. And the games that are able to blend that are some of the best.
Absolutely.
As much as I'm not a fan of the gameplay of a lot of them, I know that that's a 50-50 split on this group. From games, say what you will about them.
Jake, it's okay to be wrong sometimes. Again, Matt's not here. Gotta get in the quota.
gotta get it in, yeah. But it's like, one thing that you can't criticize them for is the way that they will tie the in-game mechanics into the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
The front game I have the most experience with is Dark Souls 2, and the hollowing mechanic is both a pure and total gameplay mechanic, and yet at the same time, it's a literal representation of something that's explained to you by characters in the story, and it's thematic at the same time. It's such a brilliant layering of both gameplay and storytelling.
Yes, and it's the sort of thing that they bring into all of the games. You've already talked about hollowing, so I'm going to talk about the other ones. But in perhaps the most dissonant one in terms of ludonarrative dissonance is Demon's Souls, because the way it's supposed to work is that if you die, your soul gets trapped by I forget what it's called. It's the Nexus, you dumbass! Yell at me all you want, Demon's Souls fans, I don't care. You get trapped in your ghost form, and then if your ghost form dies, you're donezo for good. Of course, having only 2 lives in a game like that would not be fun, so the player can respawn as many times as they like. But it does create a handy way to kind of visually signify when an NPC is for realsies dead. because there are several times when you kill the spirit form of an NPC. In later games, Bloodborne weaves it into the idea of it all being a dream. Sekiro has Wolf basically being immortal, and while it doesn't really tie into the respawn mechanic, my personal favorite instance in From games of using gameplay mechanics to tell a complete narrative and basically without any dialogue is in Elden Ring. Because in Elden Ring, there is an ending that there are, of course, like 7 endings. That's an exaggeration, but there's a lot of them. And for most of them, you get a dialogue prompt at the end that lets you choose which one you want to do, provided you did the requisite quest. You can theoretically have like 4 of them set to go at a time, but there is one where no matter what else you do, you are locked into this one ending, and it's kind of the bad ending. It's the Lord of Frenzied Flame. If you go and you embrace the Frenzied Flame, then that is the ending that you get. However, there is a way that you as a player can decide, I don't want to do the Frenzied Flame ending. I'm going to do a different quest. And the way that you have to do with that is you need to find a way to basically repel the influence of this god. And there is a way of doing that in game. It is basically a self-contained hero's journey. It involves going and helping another character through their own hero's journey in order to get a special item after defeating Melania, admittedly. But you get this special item after defeating Melania, and then you have to travel very much outside of the familiar world into the Crumbling from Azula and the Storm Beyond Time, defeat another massive boss, and to then sit at the center of time to inject the magic needle that gets rid of the fire.
Sounds like a From game.
Yeah, and then you return to the lands between, transformed by your experience. It's an entire self-contained hero's journey. Also, you can go back on the decision on which ending you want. And I just love that.
There's something to be said about multiple endings in games and how it can create such a personal story for somebody.
Mm-hmm.
The seamless weaving of gameplay and story is a really high skill in art of storytelling. Though I think one of the really interesting things is this is something that I feel From games by a razor margin barely dodge, but they're almost on the line of doing this. It also matters how you present information to the audience, because, and this is something that we can tie back to, that thing that our podcast is supposed to be about in manga, because this is like when you're telling a story, a little bit to some extent, this goes all the way back full circle to Yu-Gi-Oh! And the way that some people see Yu-Gi-Oh! A game like Pokemon actually explains away a lot of the like bad faith criticisms that it's gotten over the years. I remember there was one point where PETA was like hilariously, stupidly overboard about hating Pokemon because it's animal abuse. And like the games themselves answer all those criticisms. They just do it passively because lingering on them isn't fun.
Yeah, because we're trying to play a JRPG here. Well,
yeah.
I was about to say we're trying to play a JRPG, not answer the moral questions of the universe, but that's what most JRPGs do.
Yeah,
anyway,
a lot of them do that.
Pokemon stays in its lane in that regard.
Yeah, Pokemon very much stays. It's not Final Fantasy. But yeah, no, that's not throwing shade on Final Fantasy. It's just funny. But like one of the things I always see as an example of Pokemon is like Pokeballs don't mind control the Pokemon. And if you're paying attention to how the narrative works, that should be obvious to you. But Pokemon doesn't actually linger on that fact. Fundamentally, the player character, because they are able to complete the game, has to be a good Pokemon trainer that treats their Pokemon right. So logically, none of their Pokemon are going to be abused and ever want to leave. So, you get your, Charmander, Squirtle, Bulbasaur in a Pokeball. By the time it's a level 70-something third stage starter, strictly speaking, if you had been abusing it, it could just break out of the Pokeball and walk away and you could do nothing about it.
strictly speaking, if it's a Charizard, it can just fry your ass and fly away.
So like there is this element of like the
And-
idea that Pokemon are like mind controlled, forced, abused, forced to fight is just not there. But talking about it takes away from the experience, so they don't.
Which is supposed to be this journey of you making friends with weird little creatures and growing attached to them.
Yeah, and like there's the element of the idea of forcing Pokemon to fight. Well, no. And this and breeding is actually another example where it's like if you think about it, if you think about what concessions were made for the fun of gameplay, it gets bad really fast. But like by pure happenstance, how about that? The player character never runs into a Pokemon that's a pacifist. But if they did, the player character wouldn't force that Pokemon because like that's canonically how the player character acts.
I mean, theoretically, or extrapolating a little bit because of the way random encounters work, every time you step through the grass and don't get jumped by a Pokemon, you've passed by a Pokemon that doesn't want to fight.
But the game never explicitly says that, and it shouldn't have to.
Because again, that's a waste of time. I think it's rather poignant that all of the most fridge horror, it's actually really fucked up that this happens things are expressly restrictions or actions that distance you from the roleplay aspect of it. It's things that put you in the gameplay aspect of it, like Nuzlocks. Fainting does not equal death in the game, but in the self-imposed rule of a Nuzlocke, it is, and therefore it can be considered heartless to sacrifice a Pokemon or whatever. But the actual game isn't acting like that. Or like shiny hunting through breeding or breeding for perfect IVs. The game is not that's you just playing a competitive team building game. That's not you endorsing puppy milling.
Yeah, it's not endorsing puppy milling or incest, which is unfortunately a really good way of IV breeding. It's like that's not part of the game because that's not how the story works. That's a outside element. And it's one of those ones that I think it's sort of interesting because like I said, From Games are really good about integrating its story, but like one of the things that it does is it basically never says anything out loud. Pokemon also does that, but it's sort of I can't help but find it interesting. And I do think that this is a matter of the From Games being able to, both in a combination of subject matter and in a level of skill and craft, even though I think Pokemon is honestly better written than people give it credit for. Like there is an element of they don't mention these things, so it does kind of open itself up to this criticism, but at the same time it shouldn't have to explain it because it should be obvious. It's really interesting the way that stories and how the gain elements interact with a story. And I mean, yet again, even more so, taking the entire thing full circle to a large extent, why does Team Rocket follow the rules of Pokemon battles? Like Pokemon is a game about playing a game. It's not, it's more like a friendly boxing match or full contact football is what a Pokemon battle is. It's not actually fighting. That was what the Pokemon movie very poorly tried to convey.
Bless their heart, they tried.
They just failed. But it's like that's what they were trying to convey. It's not an actual fight. It's a competition. It's a physical competition. It's like a boxing match or full contact football. It's like you can get hurt, but if everyone's following the rules and doing it right, nobody should get permanently damaged. Ostensibly, at least that's what's said of those sports. But like that's sort of the idea behind it.
And since we've come full circle, do you have any closing thoughts here, Jake?
I think one of the closing thoughts is looking at the sort of questions you can ask when engaging with a story, especially stories that have games in them. why is the game being played? What value does this bring to the story versus it just being, free for all power, powers being thrown at each other. It things that aren't games that have these gamified elements, like what is that bringing to the table that not doing that would afford otherwise. And then of course on the other hand, looking at video game stories and seeing how they integrate gameplay, where gameplay matters relative to the story and where gameplay is actively separate from the story. Just injecting gamified elements or narrative elements into a game just opens up all of these really interesting questions to ask.
And to an extent, being able to recognize story elements is what they are is, and, asking what does this bring to the narrative, when done in good faith, is, the fun of doing literary analysis. And when you can mix it in with the fun of playing a game and the fun of gameplay analysis, it can make for a very enjoyable combination.
Yeah, so literacy is important, kids. You're not clever for saying a thing is bad actually because a gameplay aspect that isn't actually part of the story.
Because he summoned 3 blue-eyes white dragons at once. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
And as always, thank you once again for listening to the Over Manga Cast. Remember, you can find us on all of your social medias where we are at Over Manga Cast on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can also find us on YouTube where you can like, comment, and subscribe, where the episodes go up 2 weeks after they premiere on your podcatcher of choice, where we always enjoy a 5-star rating. Thank you very much for that, or whatever your equivalent is. And if you have something that you would like us to read on the show, you can tweet at us at OverMangaCast, send us an email, overmangacast@gmail.com, or go online to overmangacast.com, where you can listen to episodes and leave comments. We love hearing from you guys. We will catch you next Thursday.